Hey guys, so up to this point I have talked a lot about math and statistics and all that fun stuff, but at the heart of why I play games, it really comes down to campaign games. So I've been doing campaign games, I've been doing wargaming for a long time, probably over 30 years now because I'm getting really old. And in the middle of that, from the late 1990s all the way to 2007, I was a regular tournament guy. So I lived and breathed tournaments. It's all my group really did. But underneath all the tournaments, I still love campaigns. And so we're at a good point right now where Parabellum's getting ready to release a living campaign world, and the Underspire is getting ready to release a narrative campaign. And I think it's a good time to talk about what campaigns are and who they appeal to and maybe who they don't appeal to. So this is the first part of a series I wanted to do, a 3-part series on campaigns. And this video in particular is really going to focus on nothing more other than what a campaign is and some pitfalls that I've found over the last 20 odd years to help maybe make yours a little bit more successful, or just things for you to think about. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over here to my desktop. All right. So in 2014, I did a series of articles for Bell Lost Souls, and over the years I've written a couple articles for them. This was my narrative gaming, Forging the Narrative article. And what really prompted me to write this article back when I wrote it was there was a lot of confusion, or maybe that's not the right word, but just a lot of not really understanding what campaigns were from the internet community in general. So from the discussion boards and from Facebook and from anywhere where people were gathering to talk about wargaming, there was always a lot of confusion about campaigns, and more specifically narrative gaming. Like, what is that? Now in 2014, Warhammer was still a thing. Age of Sigmar had not yet destroyed Warhammer, but there really wasn't a concept that Games Workshop had put out in place to distinguish the difference between matched play and narrative play. And since then, it's one of the things that I've actually liked about what they've done, about the direction that they have moved into, is that they did make that distinction between matched play and competitive play and narrative play and open play is what they call it. In 2014, that distinction really didn't exist other than at our own level, right? At a people level. So, but what narrative gaming meant to me might have been something different to you, and so on and so forth down the line. It means a lot of different things, and I still think that's true right now. I still think that's true even after I go over this. How I see narrative gaming may be different than how you see narrative gaming. Now I'm going to leave links to this series up here in the video, the description. So if you want to look at what I thought 6 years ago, this was basically what was going on 6 years ago and why I wanted to talk about this. And it had generated a ton of different comments. I don't think you can see those comments anymore. If I go to the comment section, and we have 0 now, because since then Bell Lost Souls has moved on to a different server type platform, so all their old comments and whatnot were gone, unfortunately, because some of what I can talk about would be found in those comments, and you can't see those comments any longer. All right, so campaigns. We know that, again, Parabellum's getting ready to release the living campaign world, which is something that I find exciting. It's one reason why I enjoy playing. And that's one type of campaign, and I really can't get into what that is yet because they haven't told anyone what that is yet, so no one really understands how that's going to work. When you take what a campaign is really nothing more than a series of linked games that lead to an overall conclusion of some type. And what that means is campaigns aren't necessarily narrative. Campaigns can also be competitive. And the difference, of course, being a competitive game or a competitive player is one who's playing the game for the game and he's trying to win based off of what the rules allow him to do. And a narrative game or a narrative player might be taking the story or the background and they're trying to tell a story within the framework of the world. And they're going to put the story more important than they're going to put the game. Okay? So campaigns can be both. They can be both competitive and they can be narrative. They may even be a mix of the two. If you take it down a step up from competitive standpoint, if you look at a tournament or you look at a league, both of those are forms of campaigns. And what's the goal of a tournament or a league? It's a series of games that you play out where the end result is someone wins the tournament or they win the league. That's a campaign. You might hear people talk about like football seasons in the sporting world as the 2020 campaign, because that's what it is. It's a series of games that are linked together that come to an end conclusion. Now, I am not focused in this series on the competitive aspects of campaigns or competitive gaming. I think I spend a lot of time on competitive gaming when we do the statistics and we do all that stuff. This is more, again, for the narrative or the different types of campaigns that you can get into and trying to understand that mindset a little bit better. So let me bullet point, double red underline. No matter what we like in gaming, you will have someone who wants something different. They'll have different goals. We all play the game for different reasons. You have to keep that in mind. And when you're coming together with a group, it's more or less trying to find a compromise between what everyone wants. If you're lucky, you can find a group where everyone's got the same goals in mind. If you're not lucky, you may have a group where everyone, or people have polarly opposite goals, and there's going to be some conflict. And that's normal and natural. It's trying to overcome that conflict that can be a challenge. So, campaigns, narrative campaigns, different types of campaigns that I've been involved in, and some things to work around. The map campaign is a campaign that most people see in their heads when you get into wargaming, and to me a map campaign is the most fun type of campaign. It is also the one that involves the most work from the group as a whole. So a map campaign can be both competitive, and a map campaign can be narrative, or include a little bit of both. But at its soul, a map campaign is nothing more than a map that you're fighting over. It could be hex tiles, it could be free-form borders. If you're doing, for example, the Stormlands, which is the map campaign I wrote for Conquest last year, put out in 2019, that was a type of map campaign that is based off of regional areas that you can try to take. Now, map campaigns give the most context to your games, so you can actually see the regions that are being fought over, and you can control over where your armies are moving and what resources and what landmarks and what important geographical locations you're trying to take. So that's how it provides the most context to why you're there. It's not just, hey, me and my buddy are showing up at the store, I'm playing 100 Kingdoms and he's playing 100 Kingdoms and we don't care about the story, we're just playing the game to play the game. There's no context to the game, which is fine. For the map campaign, you actually have a reason. It's like, I'm fighting over this land that I need to push into the Spire's territory. So the map campaign by itself creates a meta game within the game. You will have people spend as much time strategizing on the map itself as they will playing the game. And to a lot of people, that's just as fun as playing the game because it's a game within a game. If you've played any other type of war games on computer, PC games, Total War or Total War Hammer are great examples of map campaigns because you're playing on a map and you have to strategize how your armies are moving across that map. And you can even get as deep as going into resource management, where you're trying to, build your empire and you have resources you have to accumulate. Map campaigns don't have to have those. The more complex you make them, the more crunchy you make them. Some people enjoy that, other people do not. And that goes back into knowing your group. And there's never going to be one size fits all. I have had equal success with campaigns that deal with a lot of resources. An example, the grandfather of them all, what I consider the grandfather of them all, would be the Mighty Empires campaign supplement that came out in the 1980s by Games Workshop for Warhammer. You build an empire and there's a lot of detail and a lot of depth in that campaign. There's a lot to keep track of too, so there's a lot of bookkeeping. I would put that on par with something like an old BattleTech campaign. And BattleTech is another example of a war game with a lot of depth in it, and you can get really crazy with the amount of resources you're holding and following and so forth. They're not for everyone, obviously, due to the depth. Especially today, I think that people shy away from the deeper games just because they require a much more intense investment on each player's part. The downside of the map campaign is just what I said. You have to have a deeper investment, usually. And on a map, if one person decides they don't want to play anymore, that can really mess up your entire map when you have this whole kingdom that's suddenly vacant. That can gum things up. Or, real life. Real life is the bane of gaming. When people have real life issues and they can't make their games, that can slow down the campaign on a map. So some things that I've gotten around from having that break my maps is I try to put people in teams. So having one person control one overall kingdom is something I've tried to avoid. I try to have multiple people in one kingdom because that way if one person leaves or if one person can't make a game, there's still usually someone there that can keep the thing going. That has worked the best for me overall in the past X number of years I've done map campaigns. The disadvantage of that is some people like to control their own kingdom and they don't like other people telling them what to do. So it's your personality. That all has to be managed. The personalities have to be managed. But map campaigns are key. They're ace. I love them. But they do require a lot of work. So moving from a map campaign, we can slide a little bit more generally over to a resource type campaign, but one that is not beholden to a map. So some examples of what this might be. This is a resource campaign structure, Oathmark, that just came out a few months ago. Oathmark has a type of resource campaign. It's an abstract campaign where you don't have a map of your kingdom and you don't have a map of your enemies around you, but you have a list of territories that you own and what they give you. Warhammer 5th edition used to have this as well. It's one of the only things I liked about Warhammer 5th edition, and I talked a little bit about that in a past video about the best fantasy games I've played over the past 20 years. They had a really good campaign system where you had these abstract lands, and those abstract lands gave you certain benefits to your army. So those are two examples of a more abstract map campaign. There's no map, but you have territories you can fight over, and that gives you a sense that you're part of a kingdom or you're part of an empire, and those things have impact in your games. Key disadvantage, and this also carries over to map campaigns as well because they're kind of related, is that it's really easy for one player to start accumulating more bonuses and benefits than the other players. And what happens at that point is everyone says, we're done. You've basically won because you have an advantage and none of us want to play against that advantage. That really will shorten campaigns. So you have to keep that in consideration when you're creating rule set or you want to use a rule set. You want to make sure that someone can't just run away with the campaign right away by winning a couple battles and then all of a sudden they can now field 1,000 extra points than someone else, because to be honest, no one wants to play that game. And I know we talked a little bit about competitive gaming and narrative gaming, but I'm here to say even narrative gamers don't want to usually play games that's already the results already known before they waste their time deploying their models. So you have to keep those in mind. if you're going to do an abstract system. I ran into that with Azir Empires, which was an Age of Sigmar Mighty Empires abstract rule set I wrote in 2016. It was a lot of fun, but we had a couple players that really, they knew how to game it really well, and they just had these really good benefits. And so that kind of ended the campaign before I wanted it to end. Keep that in mind. So that's an abstract system. Again, Oathmark has a good example of that. If you can find the old Warhammer 5th edition, they had a good example of that. There may be others out there. I know something like, well, those are the two that I've seen in terms of empire building or kingdom building. There are things like Frostgrave or Ragnarok, which are skirmish-based games where your players advance, but it's a little bit different because it's not like your empire. Okay. So then we slide a little bit more abstract. So we don't want to deal with bookkeeping at all. We get into what are called linked campaigns or node campaigns. Now, a linked campaign or a node campaign, there are bunches of examples of this. Games Workshop actually used to produce box sets, which were story-driven linked campaigns. And what those were essentially, you fight this battle, and based off the result of that battle, when you fight battle 2, these bonuses or penalties apply. Now, a node-based campaign is a little bit more complicated than the linked campaign, because a node-based campaign says, all right, you start with battle A, and if side A wins, you go here, and if side B wins, you go over here. And it looks like a big flowchart tree. So there's a bunch of outcomes that can happen. It's almost like the old choose your own adventure type stories, if you've ever read those. There's just a series of places you can be, and there's like, X number of nodes that you can land on depending on who wins the battles. Whereas a linked campaign is really simple. There's going to be 4 or 5 battles, and they go linearly here to here to here to here to here, and based off of these, certain bonuses or penalties apply to them. Those are the easiest to run because there's no bookkeeping really. There's no anything. You just show up, you play your game, you report your statistics, and you're done. And that's it. So from an organization standpoint and from a player standpoint, they're the easiest to get into. If you're writing one on your own, they're pretty fun to write. If you're putting the narrative behind it, that can be where the time takes place, because you have to basically write a short book, which is where I was at with the Underspire campaign getting ready to drop. There's a book behind it. You don't have to do that, but the more narrative context you have, I feel, the better. So that's just my opinion. Okay, so those are the different types of campaigns we can get into. You may have done some of those. You may have done all of those. You may have done none of those. You may have not ever had experience with the campaign. There may be campaign pieces I've missed out on. But ultimately it comes down to what type of campaign are you interested in, and then what type of campaign is your group interested in. Because that's the next part of this discussion. That's the key part of the discussion. You know what's out there, but what can you get away with? What can you put together and do? So we know that Parabellum's getting ready to drop the Living World campaign. So it's a type of global campaign. And I'm going to get more into depth on what those are in the second video. But it's a type of campaign that has the advantage of it's official. And if it's official, people are going to be more apt to look into doing it. So when you break down your group, your play group are the people who you get to play with. You have to look at what they want and what they don't want, and their likes and their dislikes. And this comes back into the competitive versus the narrative. What are we trying to put together here? And what are the pitfalls that are going to fall from this? Competitive play or competitive type gamers, they like the core scenarios. So this applies if you're trying to put your own campaign together, or you're trying to use a bot one. Like you went out and you found a Warhammer campaign you really liked from 8th edition Warhammer, like Tamarcon, for example. One of the best campaign books I think have ever existed. It's beautiful. It's leather bound. You're going to pay a lot of money for it, but it's got all kinds of stuff inside. It's got this huge narrative, and it's got custom scenarios, the whole 9 yards, right? As beautiful as that was, I know from experience from having run that campaign twice, that there are people who don't like those type of things because those campaigns deviate from official normal scenarios. You have to look at your game group. You have to look at your group and figure out what are we able to compromise? Are we able to deviate from those official scenarios or not? So that's one thing. People like static play, meaning every time they play a game, they prefer to have the table set up in a standard way, like tournament players like their table set up in however the big tournaments do them. They don't like to deviate. So if you're writing a campaign for your group, or you're using a campaign for your group that uses non-standard terrain, or uses more terrain than they're used to, or less terrain than they're used to, you're going to get people who complain about that. So that's the part where we talk about you have to know your audience. And in this case, I will tell you from experience, it does not matter if it's you who wrote the campaign or if it actually comes down from the official authors of the game system. If it deviates from the official tournament standard, you have to make sure that your group is okay with that. That you have people that are all right with doing things where it's not a standard game. Because in a narrative style campaign, it's not all about competitive balance. And that is the key. That's a key milestone or a keystone that makes up the whole narrative campaigning world. Things aren't always going to be fully balanced. That doesn't mean that things should be grossly imbalanced where there's no point in playing the game either. But when you look at narrative scenarios, from a narrative campaign standpoint, if one side has a tiny advantage over the other, that's fine. Because that's part of storytelling in war. Because in war, most of the time, one side isn't equal to the other side. Sometimes that could happen, but that's not always. And if you're trying to tell interesting stories and the sides are always the same, you're losing out on the whole spectrum of last stand fights, or these crazy I've got to kill the commander but I'm outnumbered 3-1 type fights. Those can all be fun in their own right. You just have to have the right mindset going into it, and some players really just don't like that. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with those players or that those players are bad people or anything like that. It just means that that's not how they have fun. So if your group has those types of people, and they're not going to have very much fun, you're going to struggle to get a campaign like that off the ground. And so that's where that compromise thing comes in. You have to look at minimizing how badly things can get off kilter, because some people they're not going to have a lot of fun with that. And I find that to be a hugely important. Another key fact, or another key thing to talk about when it comes to narrative games versus competitive games, and this is actually what triggered, again, the whole Bella Lost Souls article, which I wish we could look at some of the comments that were in here, because I can remember some of these, and this was 6 years ago. This one, this sentence right here, I can't highlight it because my browser wants to be that way. And again, I wrote this article for Bowles. This was something that always came out. Why would anyone actively choose to take bad units? Do narrative gamers really do not care who wins? This was a point of contention often in discussions. Competitive players versus narrative players. The narrative players, they're like, I want to take these things that no one else takes. I want to take units that people think are suboptimal. I really enjoy that kind of thing. And the narrative campaign world, those things shine because scenarios may favor them more, for one thing. And second, if everyone's not playing as hard as they can, then those B units start to, those B or C rated units start to actively have a role again, as opposed to competitive play where a lot of people just take what's super efficient and what's best. But there was still this misconception that narrative gamers don't really care who wins. I have never, and I've met people who've claimed this, but I've never actually met someone who never cared who wins. People sit down and they write a list, and maybe they're casual players, and maybe they don't put their reputation on the line to them when they go play, but they still care who wins. So narrative games still care who wins, okay? It's a common question that comes up. I still think it comes up a little bit because I see this. Why would anyone actively choose to take bad units? I see it still in forums and in Facebook comments, and it's still something you're going to see. In narrative campaigns, that is a place where those units get to actually come back onto the table. From a conquest standpoint, we don't know what the meta looks like yet because Corona kind of kneecapped our tournament season, as you all know. And so we don't know what the meta is yet. So this doesn't really apply right now to conquest, but it will. It will as soon as those big tournaments start hitting. Okay, so narrative gaming, experiencing more of the game than just the core 6. Talked about this a little bit. I'm repeating myself now, but again, why you get into narrative gaming. In Warhammer, when I wrote this, there were 6 scenarios in the book. They were the official core 6. And they were only 5 because the Watchtower scenario everyone hated, so they just would always re-roll that one. People want the core 6, right? The core 6 basically means you replace that with the core scenarios. And in Conquest, that right now is the core 3 because there's 3 basic scenarios. They're technically 4 in the book, yes, but one is the same as the other, only on a bigger table. They like those core scenarios, and that's it. And why is that? It creates a set of standards. It's like playing football, and you know the football field's always going to be the football field, right? You always know that you're going to score in the same way. You always know that the teams are X number of players, 11 players per side. You always know that the rules are basically going to be the same. That's why many people like to just stick with the core scenarios, because they take those core scenarios and then they look at the army that they like, and then they invest themselves and their money into that army, and that's it. A lot of people don't like to have these giant armies. They want to go, okay, 2,000 points is my standard. These are the 3 scenarios that are official. These are the 3 scenarios I have to be really good at. So based off of these 3 scenarios and based off the army list I want to play, these are the things that are really, really good. So they go out and buy those. And then they paint those sometimes, or they pay someone to paint those. And that's it. They don't want to have to go out and buy more things. And that's where you might get some conflict, right? So if I bring in the narrative gaming experience to my group and we go, okay, well, here's a scenario where elite units just aren't as good. Maybe they got held up in some event and I only have core units. I only have the mainstay units. I only have as many of them, right? Maybe I change in Conquest. I say you have to have 3 mainstays before you can take 1 restricted. Not saying to do that, just saying maybe that's the rule. You're going to have a lot of people get upset because they just bought their army based off of the core rules and the core scenario, and now you're here saying my list that's really good at these 3 scenarios is not going to be good at this scenario, and I don't want to play that. Personalities in your group. It's going to depend on the personalities in your group. It's going to depend on how well people can compromise on either end to come up in the middle. But part of the narrative gaming experience was to go step out of the core, how to step out of the basic static experience and see more of the game world and more of the game, which for me was a positive, but I realize that not everyone is like me. And in the comment section below, which you can't read anymore, there was a lot of contention about that particular piece right there. Because to some people, you're arbitrarily changing the rules. And it doesn't matter if it's you, some fan, writing custom scenarios like I do, or if it's the company itself writing narrative scenarios. And like in this case, it was Games Workshop, had a bunch of narrative scenarios. That didn't matter. It was a deviation from the core. You could have some problems with that. So you're going to have to talk those over with your opponents. So anyhow, that is a little bit of a discussion on campaigns. We're at the 30-minute mark, so I don't want to go on too much longer. So what I'd like is, so the next video, what I plan on doing is giving my thoughts on the Living World campaign that Parabellum is pushing out. This will be my 3rd Living World campaign. I've done 2 Games Workshop, The Storm of Chaos and The Eye of Terror, way back in the long ago, 15 odd years ago. So this does excite me. I'm very excited about Living World campaigns. There are some negative about Living World campaigns as well, which I'll talk about in the second video. I am curious to see how they pull this off. I'm excited to see this world expand. I'm excited that we have the ability to influence the world, because it makes us feel like we're leaving our mark on the world, as opposed to living in some static static battlefield that it doesn't matter if we win or lose, nothing changes. I care about the background a lot, so for me that's pretty cool. In the third video, I am going to talk about, it's going to be the reveal of the Underspire's narrative campaign, which right now is going to be roughly 100 pages. I'm waiting on some more artwork, and the writing is almost pretty much done. So there's a lot in there. There's new skirmish rule set that I wrote. It's all unofficial fan stuff, homebrew, but if it's useful, cool. If you find that it's fun, cool. I like having fan-based content, so I think that's important. So anyhow, leave some comments in the comment section. Tell me some experiences you've had about campaigns in general. I'd love to hear them. I like to talk about campaign stories. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll be happy to go into those or give you my thoughts anyway. I do appreciate you watching this here. Make sure you check the Underspire for more content pertaining to Conquest, and that is simply www.underspire.net. And again, subscribe to this YouTube channel to get notifications on when there's more content. Thanks a lot, guys. Cheers, and I hope you have a good one.